My name's Doc. I'm an alcoholic. And, a privileged alcoholic, and in fact, privileged to be sober. Beautiful. I was telling a guy outside what a beautiful night it is, and certainly a beautiful night to be sober. My sobriety date is today, 2 years ago, on March 30th, 2017. I had earlier sobriety dates, but they didn't work. I tried to do it myself. And as we all know, that really doesn't work too good, you know? I have a sponsor, and he has as many years sober as I have drinking. He just recently celebrated his 55th year of sobriety. And actually, he got sober when I was a senior in high school. And when I was a senior in high school, I did a lot of drinking. My home group is the primary purpose group. We meet on Mondays and Thursdays, 7 o'clock, at the Baptist Church down in Southern Pines. I have an extensive professional history. I'm sort of living proof that you can know just about everything possible about alcohol abuse and alcoholism and become an alcoholic, you know, which I did. And I did become an alcoholic much earlier than I really wanted to admit it and to recognize it. Drinking has always been a big part of my life, probably from the time I was 16 or 17 years old. I grew up with drinking in the family. Actually, my alcoholism probably started when I was conceived. My mother family is just loaded with alcoholism. Both of my grandparents are alcoholic. And my grandfather on my father's side actually is a native of North Carolina, from Oxford, North Carolina. And his father sent him down. He was the oldest of 7 children, from Oxford down to Raleigh to sell tobacco. And he didn't come home for a couple of days, and he came home with half the money. He had drank a good portion of it away and gambled it away. And his father told him that he had 2 options. He could either leave right now or he was going to kill him. So he lied about his age and joined the Army at the age of 16, and he was out when World War I broke out as a cavalry soldier in the Southwest chasing Pancho Villa. And then went into the Army and did all types of courageous things. Went from, I don't know, a Spec 1, PFC 1 to a Master Sergeant during the Army. 6 weeks before the war ended, he got shot up pretty bad in the Battle of Verdun in France, and they dropped him off at a little French village, and the Army proceeded to tell his parents that he was dead, killed in action. And about a month or 2 later, he actually called his mother, which was, you know, certainly quite a surprise. But he was a character. He lost his leg, had 27 operations on his leg, raised 6 kids, was a bull of a man, used to swim across Scroon Lake, and with each of his kids on his shoulders with 1 leg, and you know, he was quite a character. And I really loved him. He used to drink Seagram 7. And I never really drank that much, but I really enjoyed them. I don't look it, but I'm Irish and grew up in a very Irish culture. And Drinking was always present in my house. My mother and father probably were alcoholics, but I never really saw them drink much. They sort of just, I did a good job, I guess, hiding it from me. We moved around a lot, and my father was with the Veterans Administration, so about every 2 years we'd end up in a different place. And that was sort of unsettling, I guess. And another thing that really happened that maybe toughened me up a little bit, when I move into another community, of course, young kids want to know, what your father does. Well, my father was a registered nurse. And so back then, it wasn't that common in the 50s for a male to be a registered nurse. And so sometimes I'd have to tune up some kids on the playground just because they were sort of making fun, but that didn't really last, and it wasn't really a big part of what I was all about. And I always considered myself to be very poor growing up. And we were. I mean, I can remember my mother always crying that we never had enough money. And holidays, Christmas was just a very traumatic place. She always wanted to go back to her family in Frackville, Pennsylvania. In fact, I was born in a town called Shannon. Well, I pronounced it wrong for about 50 some odd years to show you how smart I am. But in Pennsylvania, they call it, it's up in the Frackville, Pottsville area, and they call it Shenandoah, even though it's spelled just like the Shenandoah Valley and the Shenandoah Mountains. So I mispronounced my birthplace for 50 some odd years, so they finally straightened me out. My mother was very good at telling me I almost killed her. She was in the hospital for 6 weeks after I was born. She couldn't have any more children. But 7.5 years later, she did have my brother. And my brother's been sober for 39 years. He doesn't go to AA, but he's quite a character, and he doesn't drink. And my sister's fine. So I have 2 siblings, and I have 4 children. And one child, my son Brian, is with us right now. In fact, Brian's probably the reason I'm alive and sober today, because he was really the person that got me to really take a look at how I was slowly killing myself. Professionally, I did really good. I got involved in the alcoholism business and field in 1969. And some of you who were born around 1965 probably weren't too happy with me, because I was involved in the research that really brought about the national 21 drinking age. And a lot of my kids' friends weren't happy with me, but we found when we did the research that 18, 19, and 20-year-olds made up 7% of the driving population, but were involved in 24% of the alcohol-related fatalities. And by passing that legislation each year since 1985, about 10,000 kids were saved every year. So I felt pretty good about that. I also set up the EAP programs, and some of you who might have been helped by that. They used to just wait till you got so drunk and they had a good case and they'd fire you. And now if you have some skills and talent, there are a lot of companies that say, hey, it's going to cost us a lot more money to train somebody, and just watch this fella or this gal drink themselves to death. And some of you who have been involved in drug courts. Judge Judith Kay and myself set up the first drug courts in the country, in New York City. Rather than just sending you to the slammer or sending you to the county jail and you come back out 30, 60, 2 years later, the same addict or alcoholic that you were, now we give you a chance to go to the colony or go to programs all over the country. So professionally, I did really good. Personally, I really like to drink, and I drank a lot. And people used to say, you really, for an academic and an intellectual character, you really seem to know an awful lot about alcoholism. And I jokingly used to tell them that I did a lot of field work, and I did. And probably, if I look back, my life would have been very, very different. I was a very good baseball player and really I had scholarships to college to play baseball. I had scholarships to play football at college. But I also had this attitude, I've seen the back, make gratitude your attitude. Well, I always had this attitude that I was going to do it my way, and I didn't want to coach. Back when I got out of school in the late 60s, it was much easier to get a college scholarship because they didn't have a quota on how many football players they could bring into a school. And what they'd let you do is beat the hell out of each other your freshman year, and then they'd really talk to you about your scholarship. Now, at the University of Texas, Darrell Royal, which had a really big football program, they would bring in 150 kids, most of them from Texas, and most of them pretty tough kids to play football. But he would weed those 150 kids down to about 30 kids that he would actually give scholarships to. So rather than getting a scholarship, I went to the State University of New York, and I played football and I played baseball, and I worked at a Smith Corona factory and got through school. And then I got a couple graduate degrees, and then I got a PhD. And the reason I got all those degrees really had to do with a security issue. When I was about 3 years old, for some reason I was so concerned that my mother was going to take off, because she was always telling my father that she was going to leave and go back to Mahoney Plain, which is a real desperate little community in Pennsylvania. I don't know what the hell she'd ever want to bring me back or go back, but that's what she kept saying. And I guess I really listened to that, to the point where when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I used to tie a rope to her, and she was in another room, and I would pull that rope just to make sure she was there. And so I guess I just had this attitude that I always wanted to be very secure. And I used to tell people that I wanted to be down in a bar, so again, my fixation on drinking, in the Caribbean, and I wanted somebody to tell me, we really could use a school superintendent down here. And I wanted to be able to say, I got my school superintendent's degree, so I'll be right down. And so that was sort of the attitude, I think, for all the education and all the degrees. I took work very, very seriously. I told people that if you worked for me, I just wanted you to work as hard as I did. And I would fire people, which was really unusual in state government because, most people don't think they're going to get fired. Well, I did. And sometimes, it was a little controversial, but I did. My attitude was work hard, play hard, and I played hard, and drink hard. And anything that's, worth doing, my attitude was it's worth doing to excess. And so I did that. And there are many occasions where I certainly could have been arrested, although I have been locked up in every prison in New York State, in every max prison multiple times. But the nice thing was, because I was an assistant commissioner with the prison system, I could leave at the end of the day. And I really developed some really good friends in prison. One of them that you should look up because he was quite a character, and he's one of us, and he died a year and a half ago or so, but his name is Joe Sullivan. And Joe was really an interesting fellow. He was a contract killer, and he worked for the mob in New York City. And if you look it up on your internet or on your smartphone, he was known as Mad Dog Sullivan. And he supposedly is credited with 19 kills that they know about, but probably closer to 30 or 40. And we used to talk about that, and he said it's just business. He says it's just business. He just kills people that needed to get killed. And, but the sweetest, you really want him to, marry your sister. I mean, he was really a good guy. I think humor is really important, and I've always sort of had a pretty rich sense of humor. I know the teachers would, even when I was in elementary school, middle school, and high school, I always seemed to find something funny with what the teacher said or what was going on. And I got asked to leave the class on numerous occasions because I was just being, disruptive and all that. But it served me well. I can remember a psychiatrist telling me that if you can have a good belly laugh every day, that's about the best thing that you can do in terms of preventing mental illness. I mean, and to have a good belly laugh is really to be very, very honest with yourself. So I'm going to tell you a couple jokes, but the jokes really have a meaning. And so I don't want you to think I'm just telling you jokes, but I'll tell you why I'm telling you after I tell them. There was this salesman, he was driving down a country road. Some of you people have heard this, but I apologize. And he sees this sign in front of this farmhouse. It says, "Talking dog for sale, $10. Well, he keeps going about two miles down the road. He can't stand it any longer. He turns around, comes back, and he knocks on the door of the farmhouse. And he says to the farmer that comes to the door, he says, "I understand you have a talking dog for sale." He says, "I sure do. The dog is around the back of the house in the yard. Go back and see him." The guy goes around to the back of the house, and there's this gorgeous dog. And the guy says, "You really are a beautiful dog." And the dog says, "Well, thank you." He says, I really appreciate that. And the dog says, "Would you like to hear a little bit about my history?" And he goes, "Yeah." I mean, the guy's amazed. There's a talking dog. And the dog says, "Well," he says, "I worked for the DEA. And because I can talk, I was undercover and I solved a lot of drug cases. And then the Army recruited me and I worked for them, got all types of medals in the Army, got behind enemy lines, and just medals upon medals. And then even New York City contacted me, and I went up there to work for Homeland Security, terrorists, prevented thousands of people from getting killed. And he said, you know, I thought I had made a contribution and worked hard enough, and I decided to come back here and just retire, relax. Guy couldn't believe it. So he walks around to the front of the house and he says, you know, that dog is amazing. He says, that dog has perfect diction, perfect sentence structure, and what he has accomplished is amazing. And he says, do you mind if I ask you why you were selling him for $10? And he says, yes. He says, the dog is a liar. He's never left the backyard. And I'm telling you that because I was very good during my whole drinking history of lying to myself, you know? I would see a lot of people that were obviously much worse off than I was. I was doing very well professionally. I had 4 children, played a lot of golf, lived a good life, and drank a lot, and never got caught. And drank and drove many times, even though I did most of the drunk driving legislation in New York State for the governor. I actually worked for 6 governors, and here I was a violator. I would go nowhere without a traveler. I always had a traveler in my car, always drinking. I went down to Florida to bring back a Mercedes, and this was after my wife died. My daughter was moving back up north, and her husband, they had an extra car, so they asked me to fly down and drive the car back. I drove the entire car back, drinking scotch continuously the entire trip, you know, never got stopped, never got in an accident, and many situations like that. Never got in trouble, never got arrested, never got fired, never even had any work problems. I didn't drink at work. I mean, there was a time to work and there was a time to play, and whenever I played, alcohol was always involved. That was my form of relaxation, rewards. It would make me relax, improve my sexuality, better dancer, better joke teller, on and on and on. And I was really a functional alcoholic until about 2001. And, you know, sometimes don't wish for things because when they happen, they're not as good as they appear to be. But I was fortunate enough to be able to retire in 2001, and I can remember telling people at my retirement party that now every afternoon was going to be a Friday afternoon. And what I did on Friday afternoon and Friday evening, and playing golf and drinking while I'm playing golf and drinking after I'm playing golf and coming home and sometimes being obnoxious to my family because I drank too much and I was on the golf course more than I should have been home being a father, etc. But every day now was a Friday afternoon. I could drink, and I did. I drank every day. But I was still all right. You know, I had this, I don't know. One thing I had was frugality. I would not drink out. I refused to spend $6, $8 for an ounce and a half of scotch. You know, my tongue would soak that up before I could really even enjoy it. And so I wouldn't drink out. But I would drink home, you know. I would buy handles. At the end of my career, which was just a couple years ago, my drinking career, I was going through a handle about every 2.5 days. I can remember I came down here to play golf and to drink. I came down here in 2006 because my 4 kids lived up north, and they were really being a pain in the ass about my drinking, you know. And so I figured I'd take an 800-mile journey south, plus I could play golf down here year-round, and they wouldn't be bothering me. And so I did come down here, and I did drink a lot. In fact, I knew all the people that worked in the ABC stores better than I knew the golf professionals in the golf courses, you know. I was coming out of an ABC store, and you know, I had like a box, like 2 handles in it, and scotch and vodka and all this stuff. And I can remember somebody saying to me, says, "It looks like you're really going to have a party." And I was thinking about that. Yeah, that was all for me, and that was going to be gone probably in a week. You know, it was like just my little party. I kept going to the doctor. I've got high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, and you know, so I'm taking a lot of medication. A lot of those medications say, you know, don't mix with alcohol, and so they're always doing like tests on me, liver tests, and I would always ask the doctor, now, how about the liver test? Everything is normal. Just keep doing what you're doing. You know, doctors, and of course, that's just what an alcoholic wants to hear, right? You know, I smoked cigarettes. I didn't start smoking again until after my wife died. And for about 2 or 3 years, I was just really on a drinking suicide mission. I mean, I was drinking 24/7, and you know, that's the way I dealt with grief. You know, rather than going to grief counseling, rather than talking to people, I just got myself totally shit-faced all the time. And gradually, you know, worked my way out of that. All right, that's just, I got 27 pages. I'm just on the first page. I hope people have a, you know, free evening, do you? I went to my 25th reunion, and the 25th reunion is good. I do not recommend going to your 50th reunion, because the people you see there are old, the women are fat, and I was the only person at the 50-year reunion that I thought looked really young and healthy, you know? It's really sad. But in any event, I went to my 25th reunion, and I ran into a fellow I played football with in high school. And he said to me, he says, "Are you still married to Susie, your high school sweetheart?" And I said, no. I said, Susie died. We got married, but Susie died about 5 or 6 years after we got married. He said, "Well, how did she die?" And I said, "Poison mushrooms." He said, "Well, did you remarry again?" I said, "Yeah, I met a really nice gal named Grace about a year after that, and we got married." He says, "You and Grace still together?" I said, "No, Grace died about 5 years after we got married." And he said, "Well, how did she die?" And I said, "Poison mushrooms." "Oh, my God. Did you remarry again?" I said, "As a matter of fact, I did." "Is she with you tonight?" "No, she died." And he says, "Oh, my God, don't tell me she died of poison mushrooms." I said, "No, she died of a concussion. She refused to eat the mushrooms." Now, I'm telling you that story because probably the good reason that I'm up here right now is because in 1965 I met my wife. And I wasn't going to get married till I was at least 30. My buddy and I sort of made a pact. I met her, my wife, and about a year later, I got married my senior year in college. And she was absolutely a wonderful, wonderful human being. and I couldn't love anybody more than I did. And she controlled my drinking. Even though I drank a lot, she really was like a governor. You put a governor on a car, you put a governor on a golf cart or whatever, and she really kept me in control, the way women can keep you in control, with the silence treatment or whatever. But she really is really the reason that I'm here. And then after my wife died, about a year later, I met another gal. And she's probably the reason also that I'm alive. So I've been very, very lucky with women, and we've been living together for, let's see, I better get this right, 16 years or thereabouts, 17 years, long time. Seems like a really long time, yeah. Women are very, very important to some of us. And I'm going to tell you another story. And it does have a purpose to it. And this has to do with morals. And there was this third grade teacher, and she was teaching kids about stories and the moral to a story. And she said, I want you to go home, and I want you to think about something that happened in your family. And I want you to come back and tell us the story, and then obviously I want you to tell the class the moral of the story. And so sure enough, the next day they all are back in class, and so would somebody like to begin? And yeah, little Susie raises her hand and says, yep. She says, we were having breakfast one morning, and my mother asked me to go out to the hen house and get some eggs. And I was so excited that my mother asked me to do that. So I put all the eggs in, and I came in and I tripped in the step in the kitchen, and all the eggs fell on the floor and they all broke. And I was crying, and my mother hugged me, and she said, don't cry, dear. She says, everything's going to be all right. And so the teacher says, that's a lovely story. She says, now what is the moral? And the moral of the story is, don't put all your eggs in the same basket. Teacher says, really good. Anybody else want to share a story? And little Mary says, yeah, she said almost the same thing. My mother asked me to run down and get some milk. And I did, and I was excited. I came back, I tripped, I spilled the milk all over the floor. My mother hugged me. And what was the moral of the story? And my mother said, you don't cry over spilled milk. Very good. And then little Tommy in the back of the room raised his hand. He says, yeah. He says, I'm going to tell you a story. He says, my father was in Vietnam. And he was in a foxhole. And he knew there were these 3 Viet Cong out there that were coming to get him. And he had just 1 bullet left in his rifle. But fortunately, he had a bottle of Jack Daniels with him. And my father chugged that whole bottle of Jack Daniels, and then these guys came at him. Well, he shot that 1 Viet Cong right in the forehead. And the other one jumped in, and he got him with the butt of the rifle. And the third one, he crashed that Jack Daniels, and he slit that guy's throat. And of course, the teacher's about ready to faint. And she says, Tommy, what is the moral of that story? And he says, the moral is you don't mess with my old man when he's been drinking, And I knew a lot of guys in prison that just made some really foolish mistakes when they were drunk. I had a very distinguished police detective from New York City that killed somebody in a blackout, and he still doesn't remember it to this day, what he did. Now, I don't want to run out of time here, but so I think you know what who I was. I drank a lot, did pretty good with my career. Didn't do so good with my kids, although I thought I really did, but I asked him, I told him I was going to come and talk. Is there anything that I should mention? I mean, I think I was like a perfect father. And then they all told me, and I was ready to check myself into a psych center. They told me what what a bad father I was at times, particularly Christmas, particularly holidays. I didn't like Christmas. I don't like it today. I usually stay down here with my 5 dogs at Christmas, and we have a great time. I'm also a little compulsive. Like if I lose something, I go nuts until I find it. In fact, I even hate to lose anything, particularly like in sports. I'm getting much better at it now. But I was never a really good loser. And forgot what I was going to say. I'm also sort of losing my mind, but about losing things, it'll come back to me. I mean, sometimes at my age, I'm going to be 73 in a week, and I can walk into rooms and not know why the hell I walked in that room. I don't even know what I'm looking for, you know? And then it comes to me that why I was in there. But losing. I don't know, it was a really important point I was going to make, but I forgot about it. So back in 2010, my son was getting into a lot of trouble with alcohol and drugs. And I had a lot of guilt because I was really a horrible role model and a horrible example. He would see me drinking, and driving, he would see me partying. As he told me, he would see me passed out on the kitchen floor in a tuxedo coming back from a governor's party or something like that. And always wondered what I did at the governor's party. But in any event, he was getting himself in some trouble. So I came into AA. In fact, I came right here. I used to go to the 7:30 meeting in the morning. But I was really doing it for him, you know. I did 357 days of, 457 days, probably close to 550 meetings. Sometimes I'd drive quite a distance if I was playing in a golf tournament to go to a meeting, but I didn't want to break the streak. And then for some reason I broke it. And probably 6 weeks later I was drinking, you know. And but the important thing, I was doing it not for myself. I was doing it now I know, for somebody else. And I did not have a good relationship with God. I was raised a Catholic, and by the time I was about 19, Irish Catholic, I really hated the church. You know, I hated just about everything it stood for, particularly the sin, the guilt. I can remember I went to a Catholic school in a rather poor community, and we had a nun in 3rd grade that was wheeled in a wheelchair. She was probably about 85 years old. Now, we're 3rd graders. You know, we're supposed to be moving around a little bit. Education should be a little active at that age. And she would come in and she would sit at her front desk, this fat little nun in her nun outfit, you know. And she would stare. She would stare. And she would stare until she got some little kid to pee in his or her pants. I'm serious. Every day, that's how we started that classroom. So I moved into another community a couple years later. In 5th grade, I found out I couldn't read. You know, I was really good at not peeing in my pants when a nun was staring at me, but I could not read. And then about the time I was 18 or 19, I was really anti-religion. In fact, I was pretty much, most of the time growing up, atheist and agnostic. I didn't even want to hear people talk about God. I didn't, I used to get irate if you'd hear some golfer or some football player, you know, but for the grace of Jesus Christ, you know, I'm here and we're doing great. I said, don't give me that bullshit. There's, you know, a lot of other people on the other team that lost. Why wasn't Jesus Christ taking care of them at the same time? And plus, I think he's got more important business than whether you can throw a touchdown pass or whatever. In fact, when my wife died, I used to sit there and drink myself silly in my wheelchair. That was like my favorite thing. I had a wheelchair, and it was in my garage. There was nothing wrong with me, and I used to sit there. Well, there was something wrong with me. I was drinking a lot. But I would sit in a wheelchair, and people would go by and they'd see me in a wheelchair. And I liked that wheelchair so much that I went to a garage sale and bought another one, just in case that one broke, you know? And I still have 2 wheelchairs. And, I would sit there, and I was so angry at God for my wife's death and a lot of other things that was going on, that I wanted to get them. I wanted to get my hands on them. In fact, I knew exactly what I was going to do with them. I was going to grab his testicles, I was going to get him in a helicopter twirl, and I was going to smash him into a tree. Now, that's not really a healthy attitude. But that's where I was at. I was sick, I was drinking, and I wasn't having a whole lot of fun. I've been sober for 2 years. I've only been back in the program for about, in the AA program, I don't know, June of last year I came back in. But again, I got back in, another problem with my son. So my son's really saving my life. And I really got into a higher power. And in March 30th, 2 years ago today, I was so angry at alcohol that I just couldn't believe what alcohol was doing to somebody that I really loved. It was doing a lot to me too, but again, I didn't recognize that. And it must have been a divine intervention, but from that day, I have never had even the urge to drink. Even the urge. Now, when I would stop in the past, and I would stop many times, stop for Lent, you know, stop to prove myself I could stop and all that stuff, I always felt like I was depriving myself. You know, what happens if I win the lottery? I'm going to have a few drinks there. What happens if I get a hole-in-one? Well, I'm going to have a couple of drinks there. Well, a couple of months ago, I had a hole-in-one and had no desire to drink whatsoever. And if you're out on the golf course, there's some drinking, and there's a lot of, you know, not here. I mean, we used to spend hours in my golf course when I was younger in what is known as the 19th hole. You know, you drink for 18 holes, but then you go in there and then you do some serious drinking. And fortunately, I lived on the golf course, so I didn't have to drive home. And because I'd still probably be in the slammer if I had to drive home from the golf course. But I've had a divine intervention, and I really have a higher power now, and I really believe in it. I don't know who he or she is. I know my higher power talks to me through you people. I hear you all the time when I go to meetings. And who are we to think that this higher power even speaks our language, you know? I mean, you know, we're not that advanced, maybe, you know? Certainly not as advanced as a higher power. I mean, it's like me trying to communicate with an ant, you know? I just can't, and many of us probably, when we've woken up and passed out, we've been around ants on the ground, you know, but they're hard to communicate with. And So you can't expect he's going to send a message down. You're going to hear this, deep voice. Now, I've always had a favorite number, and I never knew why, but 27 was always my favorite number. And if you look behind me, there are 27 words in the Serenity Prayer, So I think the big guy or the big gal sort of had a plan, And I think attitude is, you can't weigh it. It's so important, a positive attitude. 35 out of 36 alcoholics die alcoholic. They never get treatment. They never get treatment. And every one of us is at least here. And so we know a little bit, and some of us know a lot about alcoholism. So we're very, very lucky to be exposed to this. And the AA program is an unbelievable program. Scotty Peck, who wrote Roads Less Traveled, they asked him, he was a psychiatrist, highly published author, and they asked him what he thought was the greatest invention during the 20th century. And he said, without a doubt, Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, we're looking at going to the moon, we're looking at the development of computers, we're looking at all types of very, very technical things, even the development of airplanes and automobiles and on and on and on. Alcoholics Anonymous was the greatest invention of the 20th century. And they asked him why, and he says, because it empowers people. It empowers each and every one of us, okay? And it really does. It works. If you do this program and you take it serious and you pray, this program really works. So, TC, I want to thank you for inviting me, and I thank all of you, and I wish you all a sober and healthy and joyous life.